You are listening to the e-flux podcast. I'm here today with members of the New Museum Union's bargaining committee, Dana Kopel, Gabe Gordon, and Francesca Altamura. Thank you for joining me today. I wanted to start off asking about what spurred the decision to form a union at the New Museum.
That's a good question. I think there were a lot of things. I mean, the decision to unionize came out of a lot of broader conversations about what wasn't working at the museum. And some of those things are also like what wasn't working in the art world, what still isn't working in the art world in terms of pay, but also transparency, like just like the workplace culture, a sense of disposability around some of the lower paid jobs. That really prompted conversations around like what kind of change we want to see and how we might go about doing that.
Yeah, I'm going to be really cheesy and say what really spurred it for a few of us initially was sort of friendship and this workplace culture of not saying hi in the elevator. And for me and for a few others, I think that was something that we immediately wanted to change. So we would start by, yes, as Dana said, just having these conversations, which eventually led to some salary shares and really trying to be open and transparent about how we felt in our job, what role we played, how we could, do better amongst ourselves and our workflow. And from there, it sort of led to something bigger.
I know that there's also mention on your website about how the union kind of fits in with the New Museum's mission, the original mission. Can you speak to that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think we're really lucky to be working for an institution with that history. Marcia Tucker founded the museum in 1977 with like this really radical vision for like rethinking what an art institution could be and should do. And she was really committed to rethinking that. I think as the unionization process was sort of developing, I was working on editing this volume of Marcia Tucker's writings that just came out. And so that was very much in my head, just in terms of like, how can institutions act responsibly and like who are they beholden to? And she had really amazing ideas about like everybody at the New Museum getting paid the same amount and people rotating jobs so everyone knew what everyone else's jobs looked like. And I think the contrast between that really like radical, equitable vision for like how institutions should be and should develop, it was just a big contrast to the way like things were going at the museum like a year ago. I think that prompted a lot of us to think more critically about like how the New Museum functions and what role we play in that and how we can change it.
Yeah, I'd add that legacy for many of us who work there was a driving factor in our decision to apply to work there. Folks from various departments, whether it's curatorial or those who are, handling the artwork, to people who are even front of staff representing as visitor services. There's, the New Museum has a reputation publicly, for the most part, of upholding those principles that Dana outlined, that Marcia Tucker built the founding museum on. So to be part of an institution that promotes that legacy and does it quite beautifully in the work it shares and the boundaries it pushes in its exhibitions, to start to recognize that, like, sometimes that, sort of like marker of progressiveness can be taken for granted, and to feel that we want those tenets to be practiced internally just the same way that they are externally articulated. When Marcia Tucker founded the New Museum, she wasn't necessarily like getting rid of the idea of a museum. She still very much believed in the potential of what a museum could be and should be for a public or for artists or for the people working inside of it. And I think the decision to unionize was to push that forward. Like, no, we think that this can be what we want it to be and what we need it to be. And by sharing our individual experiences, being very siloed off in our different roles, and learning what was collectively happening to all of us and what people who had left the museum have experienced, it started to become very clear that a union, an organized effort across the staff would be the most exciting way to go about achieving those things for not just us, but the people who worked here after us.
With that in mind, it's not always the first thought of office or professional workers to start a union, and especially in the culture sector where there's kind of an expectation or a rhetoric about how in demand some of these jobs are and kind of being grateful for what you have. So how did you convince other staff members that a union was the way to move forward?
Honestly, it wasn't that hard.
We had some people who were super gung-ho from the beginning and dropped that in quickly.
Yeah, which was really cool. I mean, I think it's true that unions have not been a major part of the contemporary art world, really. I mean, MoMA's been unionized since the 70s, but that's sort of a large exception. But I think there has been movement more generally, towards unionizing. I think in media, in the past few years, that's been something that's on my mind, and I think other people's as well. And I think it's also changing just in the past year with our process. So many people at other institutions across the country have reached out to me being like, how did you do this? How do we do this? Seems good. I'm like, it's great. Yeah. So I love when that happens. And I love that it's changing because it's a really powerful way of breaking through that sort of prestige mentality that you're lucky to have these jobs. It's these are jobs. You are going to work. You should be compensated fairly for your work.
Yeah, and that's a very niche way of thinking. It's definitely maybe applies to the curatorial department and maybe some of these specialized departments where, it is cool to be working there and it is great for your career and these sorts of things. But when we really got down to speaking with the other staff, more likely than not need a paycheck. And of course, they, want to represent the museum in a certain way, but, need the money and the healthcare and all these things. It's really, it was kind of doing it for them as well. That's where the collective bargaining comes in.
And you think also about who has not pursued these jobs, who has the same interests or skill sets, not necessarily same education, but just sort of interest in being in this kind of cultural industry, and who may have chosen not to pursue a certain job because the salary was not livable for them, or the benefits or lack thereof were just not going to cut it for the way that they needed to live their life. So there's obviously, a class consciousness and a racial critique that is super necessary to have and valid for when we look at ourselves and the body, the workforce that we are at the New Museum. And to think further about an industry that's more equitable, an industry that would pay people equitably and let people, work at livable wages would inherently, I believe, lead to a much more what we would describe very generally as a more diverse workplace, or a place that's more accessible to people who might not fit the same sort of academic background or criteria on a CV that might find themselves working. And that's, to me, to go back to what we were saying before, what the New Museum kind of really wants to be. So a lot of people, we had this really wonderful social media campaign where a lot of artists and allies who are affiliated or just in support shared what they were specifically supporting us for. And you saw the term trust fund wages show up a lot. And I just think that's really interesting because the reality is to think of us as being lucky to have these jobs often doesn't mean you're really lucky to have a career of growth and creative and intellectual vitality in front of you. It means you're lucky to be floating in this elite sort of world that we're self-defining ourselves as. And it's true that you can't start at a salary this low if you don't have some sort of external support in New York City. And it's also very true that people who are more often to have that external support come from traditionally, exclusively white backgrounds. And I think that's a longer term thing that we're trying to push for and not just be myopic in what we want to see at the New Museum.
Who can be a member of the union?
So it includes all full-time staff except for supervisors and managers and confidential employees. That's an executive assistant. Those are people who legally can't be in the union. And then it includes all part-time like front of house staff, like visitor services in the store, as well as the art handlers and contract registrars who work part-time, like in advance of exhibitions, doing install and deinstall, but otherwise are, not at the museum full-time.
I know there was a little bit of contention with the museum about who counted as a supervisor. How was that determined?
That's a great question. Yeah, so it's a really common way of weakening unions by just trying to like winnow down the bargaining unit as much as possible. And the New Museum tried that. We ended up going to the National Labor Relations Board and had hearings for a number of positions, mine included, and ultimately sort of like settling with the museum on most of them. There were 2 positions that we waited for the decision from the labor board. That was mine. I'm the senior editor. And then the associate curator position. And the labor board ultimately decided that we were rightfully in the union and not supervisory or managerial, which was great. And then the New Museum appealed that, which was unfortunate. But now that we have a contract, they agreed to drop the appeal. So I think most of the people, not all, but most of the people that we thought would rightfully be in the union are in the union.
And is there a reason why security and maintenance workers aren't a part of the union?
Yeah. So security, unfortunately, there's like really bad legal precedent around that. And so security workers and non-security workers can't be in the same union. The idea is that like if would be a strike, there would be a conflict of interest because security's job is to protect the employer's property. It's shitty, but that's what we were up against. With maintenance, we really wanted them to be included, and I think there just wasn't enough interest, and like perhaps because of like class and cultural barriers, we didn't do the best job we could have in terms of organizing with them. But yeah, ultimately, like we didn't want to push people to do something that they didn't seem open to.
So how are the demands decided?
In terms of the contract?
Yes, yeah.
I mean, we did talk about demands really early on, before we even decided to unionize. But I think once you go into contract negotiations, there are certain things that are sort of more obvious, like wages and healthcare and things like that. And like so much of that stuff came out of surveys that we took of everyone in the bargaining committee just to get people's feedback on what was important to them, what their situations are now, what they think they should be, et cetera. And then we had a lot of really great feedback from our Local 2110 also in terms of maybe the less obvious stuff that goes into a contract, especially a first contract about like union rights, things like meeting space and grievance procedures that are super crucial in order to like make the contract enforceable and make the union continue to exist and be strong. And so, yeah, we had a lot of great guidance on that.
Yeah, the surveys were not only broad and extensive, but accompanied by like a lot of in-person meeting and conversations between, not just us who are sitting here today, but other people who are working as organizers or interested in having these conversations. To what like Frankie mentioned before, like before the contract, I think the most material thing we had was these new friendships that we're fostering across the museum. And I also think that as far as articulating demand, what was important to understand is that we are several sort of, even though we're not including everyone who works at the museum, we're including a lot of people who do a lot of very different things. So in realizing that our demands for healthcare were specific to what part-timers don't currently have and to what full-timers do have now but need better, to the way that art handlers are treated in a very specific context. So understanding that the context of our demands we're trying to tailor to individual experiences while also meeting our like collective needs. It's also been, New Museum sort of struggles with like institutional memory, I think, because we have a really high turnaround, which is certainly not something that wasn't really to our benefit. The fact that like it's really hard to kind of understand a comprehensive look at the museum's past practices when the people who we're advocating for haven't been around for that long, and the people who we even started some of these conversations were leaving in the process because they had to find better jobs or they had other opportunities show up. I guess like we relied a lot on not only the data of who was present, but like the the memory and histories of those who have worked for longer or are allies who were former employees as well.
Totally. And I think just to your point, like turnover, like the really high turnover at the museum is one of the reasons we organized. And it's also like one of the reasons we organized so quickly. We unionized. That drive lasted a couple months, and we got our first contract in less than a year. And that's a pretty quick timeline for most unionization campaigns. And we were really up against, as Gabe said, like people just not really being able to sustain themselves at the museum, and so leaving and finding other jobs. And so, yeah, tracking down that institutional memory and making sure that things that needed to be addressed that like we might not know about, but somebody who worked there previously did. Like, yeah.
So yeah, congratulations on reaching your first contract with the museum. That just happened last week. Can you go into some of the specifics about what was agreed to in the contract?
Maybe just to preface, and it's something that we definitely learned from our union reps, the experienced people who had been doing this for years, is that it's a package. So while at some points, people were more focused on wages, let's say, while other people really wanted better healthcare coverage, there was more impetus to like try to sort through everything. So while we had some very specific priorities, one of these included a $51K minimum living wage. We ultimately settled for a 46 tier 1 for full-time employees.
Yeah, and we managed to input like minimum salaries and wages for pretty much everybody at the museum, which is huge. They're not as high as they should be. That's going to be a work in progress, but they're substantially higher than what people had been making previously. Like we have a $46,000 minimum salary, as Frankie said, for people in like the first grade in this breakdown of like full-time staff that we agreed on. And, previously people were getting hired at like 35 or 40 a year.
Yeah.
And so that's a pretty substantial difference.
Yeah. And this includes like myself, the curatorial assistant, someone who had been hired at such a low wage. So it's kind of a big win for someone like me and others who are hired at that really, really low salary from the beginning.
Also, like people in visitor services in the store were making like basically just over minimum wage. And Liz, another member of the bargaining committee who works in visitor services, was saying when she was hired, she was told not to expect a raise, that there would never be a raise. And so we got like a really big increase for them, to $18 an hour minimum, which will go up to, I think, $20.50 by the end of the contract, which is in slightly less than 5 years. And so, obviously they deserve more, but that's a big increase, and that felt really good.
Something that's essential to any contract, but I think we really achieved a successful and like robust version of is the actual sort of system of accountability and like grievance procedure that holds people accountable in management to respecting what the contract has achieved, and also just respecting like our workplace rights, and gives out a really clear and I think equitable way of approaching a situation in which our rights as employees at the museum are infringed on. So that's really nice to know that like there's, the new museum until 2019 didn't have anyone with an official human resources title. Not to say, personal opinion, that human resources is like the definitive solution to making sure that people are like comfortable and safe and happy in their workplace, but it's a big step for this museum to have an agreed upon system of accountability that at least prioritizes hearing out to full capacity what's going on with their employees.
Definitely. And ultimately, like, if it escalates to like the final step, will result in a decision from an outside arbitrator that's like neutral and binding. And so that's a big deal. Like it evens out the power dynamic a little bit between like the workers and management. Gives people a chance to like address issues that they're experiencing at the museum with the contract. I think a lot of this stuff, particularly around union rights, it seems counterintuitive that this is the case, but those were really hard fought. Like the museum was very resistant from the beginning to giving us basics like a bulletin board in like in the offices where we could communicate stuff about the union. They like were really resistant to letting us meet at the museum. They resisted letting us have contract negotiations at the museum, which is something that has changed now in this contract. So for whoever's doing this in 5 years, they will be able to meet at the museum instead of at the lawyer's office in Midtown. And so that's really exciting. That's something that I'm really proud of because it was a battle.
Yeah, I think we achieved a lot in the realm of transparency, not only in recognition that like the union exists, but beyond like the fact that there'll be visual and like open communication amongst us with something like a bulletin board, which is a really big deal. The museum has now like committed to like informing us of what's happening, things that will impact our day-to-day, whether that's new construction or painting or things that will impact whether it's health and safety or just workflow, to notifying us of when people are leaving, to when new positions are opening, forging a really open stream of conversation between us in tandem with the union. I think I'm excited to see how that will go, hopefully a really long way in building trust in every direction. So I don't know. I think that's really cool. Transparency is something that like word came up earlier that when looking ahead, I think a lot of us feel really jazzed about feeling is present. And amongst us too, as like we have a contract, but we are still a union. And in many ways, the big work now begins to figure out how we operate as something with legs that has a normalized presence and will continue on, I don't know, beyond our tenures at the museum forever. Yeah.
Yeah, also looking to the future, within the contract, we negotiated to have a labor management committee. And I think for some of us who are really looking forward to having sort of a long and prosperous career here at the New Museum, it's a nice way to voice our opinions and to sort of repair relations between management and the union and sort of really let them hear what things are important to us and what things we think should be changed. So I think that's also a really nice thing that we should mention. Yeah.
So how has press around this helped or hindered the process?
I think we've gotten really great press coverage, and we're really grateful for that. I mean, I think there have definitely been moments where the feeling internally is like, oh, like the museum doesn't really care about its workers that much, but they do care about their public image. And so like our like being able to mobilize that like in support of the workers and the union has been like really valuable. I think the tricky thing has just been like most people like in and out of the press like don't totally know how unions work because it's just not common now in the art world. Like I definitely didn't know how unions worked until I sort of helped make one. And so just being able to communicate the intricacies of the like legal process and like the bargaining process and things like that is something that like I, as someone who's spoken to press a bit more, like I've had to figure out how to communicate that in a way that makes sense to people.
Yeah, I think, well, Rachel, you touched on this. I think you did that. Like unions, the logic around unions, even though a lot of people don't. Like I learned so much from this process, and I mean, all of us did, no matter how fluent we were in labor politics before this, are having some sort of moment. Like there's a sort of cultural. There's an aura around them that's, I think, is like undeniable, at least in certain circles, maybe in New York or in certain industries where it's a combination of national politics meets like local individualized efforts like this. I think press was often really kind of in our favor for the fact that we were part of a larger wave. We may have, there may not be many other museums of a similar size or stature to the New Museum who had been unionized before this, but we are definitely not the only one. And even after we formed our union, several other amazing peers in this landscape of like the cultural industry are doing their own thing. So I think that press was generous in terms of speaking to the people that we usually speak to. And I think what could always go further is like linking this to maybe like larger conversations about the importance of labor in other industries, we're part of UAW, and the General Motors was on strike in Detroit over their contract negotiations, focusing on their own manifestations of what are the same sort of things we're looking at. Like, to be specific, the rights of temporary workers, which may look different in an auto manufacturing industry and in a museum. But I think that our presence in the press also brought up a lot of really important conversations, or maybe critiques of a sort of idea that I think that echoes this idea of entitlement, maybe. I'm stumbling over my own words, but it goes back to the sort of idea of feeling lucky to be at this museum. Okay, these kids are
Yeah, well, I think it definitely does push the question of solidarity in a really interesting and important way. I think some of the resistance within cultural institutions to unions, or some of it that I've encountered, is this is, we're not coal miners. This is specialized work. We work in a museum, whatever. Which obviously everyone should unionize, but it also that really erodes solidarity between cultural workers and every other type of worker. And so it feels really powerful that we are in the UAW with these other actual auto workers who are on strike and thinking about how we can show up for them. And that's a nice thing about being in a union. It's people understand solidarity through the practice of it.
Yeah, I was just going to say that solidarity was not in my vocabulary at all. Having worked in the arts since I was 16 through various internships and things, it's so nice to hear when your friends who are going through similar struggles, can say wow, you're doing great work, and without having to sort of divulge into all the information they can sort of see from the press and our social media campaign and website, that these issues are pressing and relevant to their lives as well. So it's kind of nice to see that across institutions in New York, especially.
If I can add one more thing about press, I think it's certainly it was something we tried to approach somewhat strategically. And I think if you look at the last several weeks and where we ended up and when we ended up with the contract, I think that there is a narrative and cycle that sort of propelled us to reaching a contract when we did. And that was the fact that we went into a marathon final few days of negotiations after a really sort of, I don't know what's the word, a strike vote, a strike authorization vote that was very, very overwhelmingly in support of giving us the authority to call strike. And the press, in articulating that publicly, I think that certainly, if not, directly influenced decisions that management or both sides made around the table, certainly set a broader tone for where and when we ended where we did. I think it's also it's interesting to think about the next show that's opening up at the museum is a big survey show of the work of Hans Hacke, who is, I would be hard stretched to find a more timely artist, or at least an artist who could more easily draw connections, poetic or very practically, to what's been taking place at the museum. His work for decades has all been around the sort of making transparent the systems of power, both in the art world and these systems that we're a part of. And we put the museum, I think, and ourselves in a place where, is this show going to happen? Will it? And if it does, and we don't have a contract, what does that mean from a PR perspective? If it doesn't, and we reach a contract, what does that mean from a sort of movement and solidarity perspective? How are we going to navigate this while also still the show's going to be great. So I think that timing was sort of part of a press narrative, and who knows what other versions of that could have unfolded. But I think we're really, really grateful that things unfolded the way they did, because we were not trying to go on strike.
Right, exactly. It's we're prepared, but we're happy we didn't have to. But I do think, as Gabe said, that strike authorization vote absolutely put the pressure on the museum to really negotiate with us. And that's what got us the contract that we have. Yeah, that's what was necessary.
So kind of wrapping up everything, what would you three like to see happen in the future with this union? And also, do you have any suggestions for other culture sector workers on how to form unions at their workplaces?
Yeah. I guess in response to the first question, I would love, foremost for the union just to be normalized at the museum. There's a lot of tensions that this brought up and like ways that those were like stoked by management. And yeah, I think everybody is just excited for this to just become like an everyday part of our work there, which is, I think, what we all wanted from the beginning.
I kind of want this is sort of cynical, but I kind of look forward to the moment in however many years it is where, some, member of the museum in management is speaking at a gala or something being like, and in 2019, we welcomed we unionized, like leading a cascade of radical institutions to follow suit behind us. Like, I'm waiting for the museum to kind of like incorporate this into their narrative.
Yeah.
We'll see. I think there's like a lot of dust that has to settle before that happens.
But I think it will happen. And it's, it could have happened sooner. But it's true. I think this is going to become more common. And as more institutions unionize, it's going to be easier for each one to sort of, just normalize the process. I think in terms of people who want to unionize your workplaces, definitely
so easy.
Do it. No, I mean, it's a lot of work, but like incredibly worth it. I think the biggest thing is talk to your coworkers. That's a good place to start because so much of this is just about conversations and getting to know people, getting to know their needs and their hopes and their frustrations about work and figuring out together how to like address those. We, as Frankie mentioned, we started a lot of our early conversations with a salary share, and that's a really important tool for just letting people know like where everyone's actually at, and like it brings people together in a way. I think it definitely did for us.
And one thing, both specifically in the New Museum Union and any other shops out there, like I look forward to seeing more people taking leadership roles. And I don't just mean like people to do the work we did, but like we did not get to a contract just by the work of the bargaining committee itself. There were so many of our coworkers who put in so much time, mental, physical energy towards organizing. And I really look forward to some of those people who might not have been at the table negotiating to continue to like work for the union and on behalf of the union in the roles, whether it's the labor management committee that Frankie referenced earlier, or as a steward, or to continue to sort of talk about these things in other platforms, because they heard a lot of us talking to them as we shared updates, but we also heard so much from them about like what they needed and what they wanted and what they were doing. So it is a collective effort, and I think just to like see that continuously look like that over time will be really, really cool.
Well, thank you so much for coming in and sharing your experience with us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.